Jacob, I can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm muted. I just realized it. Thank you.
No problem. I just
All right. All right, for real this time. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream of History podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor James McGrath. And today we're going to be discussing the Q document, a hypothetical source that the majority of scholars believe existed that served as a source for what the material that Matthew and Luke had in common that's not found in Mark. So anyway, thank you for joining me once again, James.
yeah, pleasure to be here. And yeah, if we go by what's known with certainty, then this will be a very short conversation.
And before we continue, I do have a link to James's YouTube channel in the description below, and to one of his recent books, which is also down there as well. So before I get to my other questions, I want to start off with, let's kind of like recap for people that are generally not familiar with the Q source, that don't know anything about the synoptic problem. Can you give everybody a summary about what all that's about?
Yeah. And it's good to provide these because a term like synoptic problem, right, is widely used among scholars, and we have a tendency to throw it into conversations and shouldn't assume that people will know what it is. But there's this question that's important whether you're interested in early Christian literature as literature or in history and possible events behind it. It's important to both of these things, and it's the relationship between Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And the reason that's important is if we can't figure out which of those knew the others, we don't know the value of the testimony that's in them, right? Because if we have three witnesses corroborating things independently, that's pretty strong evidence. If we have one that's copied by two others, then doesn't mean that what's described didn't happen, but it certainly is on a less strong evidentiary base. And it's just the principle that also shows up in biblical law, but also in modern law, that just because you have one person's testimony to something, it's usually not considered enough to convict them, right? And historians are doing the same thing. Even on the literary level, right, if we think that Luke knew Matthew and left stuff out of the Lord's Prayer, even though he knew the full version in Matthew, then that'll give us a certain impression. If Matthew used Luke, then Matthew added. And if both used a common source, then that provides some other possibilities, right? And so there's a strong consensus that both Matthew and Luke used Mark, right? They follow Mark's order for the most part, very close to the wording, identical wording in places. And so the Q question, or the cool question, I don't know if there's a shorter way of putting it, is, did Matthew know Luke or Luke know Matthew? And if we are persuaded that neither is the case, then they must have had a shared source that provided the material that they have in common that's not found in Mark. And that's what Q refers to, the hypothesis that Matthew and Luke, rather than one depending on the other, have shared material because both drew independently on a common source for that material.
What is that common source? What is the material that's thought of to be in Q?
So it starts with John the Baptist, presumably. And anyone who knows what I've been writing on lately will not be surprised that I've worked John the Baptist in fairly early in our conversation. But the truth is that that's the first point at which we have things that Matthew and Luke add to what's in Mark, things that aren't in Mark, and yet Matthew and Luke share. And so while you'll often hear, right, and I'd say that it's probably the predominant scholarly view that it was a saying source that was then supplemented, the truth is that our earliest Q material has narrative, right? It's about John the Baptist. And so there are debates about what this document looked like if it existed. Some have tried to identify layers to it and things like that. But the kinds of things that are in there, moving on from the shared John the Baptist material, are things like what most people are familiar with from the Sermon on the Mount, but a lot of them are also in Luke. Luke has Beatitudes, right? Blessed are sayings, where Matthew has, blessed are the poor in spirit. Matthew has, blessed are you who are poor. Right? Matthew doesn't have woes that go along with it, whereas Luke does. And so there's a lot of teaching attributed to Jesus in there as well.
What about the virgin birth? Because that is something else in common between Matthew and Luke. I know that's not really thought to be in Q, but did they have another common source for that kind of stuff in the genealogy?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And what's interesting is that both Matthew and Luke include a genealogy, and yet they include incompatible genealogies. And it's not hard to figure out why one of them might have changed the other there, right? There's this inclusion of sort of the royal line via an individual, a ruler named Jeconiah, right? And there's this prediction that no descendant of his would sit on the throne. And so if Jesus is his descendant, then that violates that prediction, right? So they're not the same genealogy, but both have genealogy. And that might be something that suggests shared material, right? Even if one is rewriting the other. It's actually the infancy stories that are one of the strong reasons why I think that we don't have Matthew using Luke directly, nor Luke using Matthew, and that it's more likely that there was a Q source. That there was some sort of miraculous conception is the sort of thing that, on the one hand, might have circulated verbally, and on the other hand, it's the kind of thing that ancient authors would have been inclined to invent about a figure like Jesus, right? And so both of those are possible explanations for why it shows up in both that don't require one directly reading the other's work. The differences between them, though, right, unlike the case of the genealogy, where I can think of a good reason why someone might have rewritten the genealogy, it's really hard to imagine Luke having Matthew's infancy story and deciding to tell one that really involves incompatible geographical movements and diverges from it in other ways that are not just differences, but create tensions with Matthew's story. Right? If Matthew used Luke, the same thing happens. And so the infancy stories, I think, it's explicable how we could have them in both of these gospels, right? And it's possible that Matthew might have heard of what Luke wrote without having seen a copy, or vice versa, right? That won't explain, though, the points in material like the teaching of Jesus where there is lengthy agreement verbatim in places, and there's this agreement in order across a lot of the material. And that's the kind of thing that doesn't happen just by word of mouth. It requires a written source to be involved.
So what other sources do you think Matthew and Luke used to acquire that information about the infancy narrative and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I'm pretty persuaded that, and make the case for this in recent books about John the Baptist, that there was a Baptist infancy story, right? A story about John that was developing in this time period. And I think we can see some indications of the contours of that by looking at the Gospel of Luke, and because it includes some material about John. Some of what's in Matthew probably also reflects the influence of that, right? And so it may be that one explanation for the convergence and yet divergence is that both Matthew and Luke were adapting in different ways material from a John the Baptist narrative and making it either entirely or partly about Jesus. So that's one possibility, right? But there's more than one, right? All I would say with a high degree of confidence is that storytelling about John, his significance, his infancy, preceded similar kinds of storytelling about Jesus, and so inspired it. Whether that was in written form already prior to Matthew, prior to Luke, that's harder to pin down. But certainly in the case of Luke, it really does seem like he has written source material about John the Baptist, and is incorporating some of that, including some things that are overlaps with Matthew, right? And so might be from Q, but also other things as well.
So now I'd like to ask you about the minor agreements. As you know, some that try to object to the Q theory, or they'll still say, "Well, Q existed, but we got to have Luke using Matthew in a reverse to at least explain the minor agreements." What do you think of that?
Yeah. I mean, on the one hand, I've seen scholarship that goes through them and tries to explain how they could come about. Because we don't have the originals, I mean, it's even a possibility that some of them may have come about through scribal harmonization, because we do find the Gospels being made to conform to one another in some copies, right? So, for instance, the things that Luke doesn't have in his version of the Lord's Prayer get added in some later manuscripts, right? And so that's certainly a possibility. On the other hand, I certainly have been thinking more and more about the possibility that it might be worth spending more time exploring and going in detail through something that's been proposed before, but not really elaborated and explored in depth or detail much, and certainly not recently. Namely, that Luke might have had Mark, Matthew, and something like the Q source, right? And just as he prefers Mark over Matthew because he recognizes that Matthew is secondary, and so Mark wrote these things first that are also then found in Matthew, he may have also recognized this source that included teaching of Jesus and stories about him and John the Baptist, and likewise recognized that it preceded Matthew and was used and adapted by Matthew, and so preferred it, right? And so that would explain the points at which Luke seems to agree with Matthew and might, the points like minor agreements could be taken as indicating knowledge of Matthew. They could also indicate that there was more in Q, right, that overlapped with, Mark as well, right? That's another possibility. But it could be that Luke is using Matthew and something like Q and just prefers Q, right? Just like he prefers Mark.
Could you tell us a bit more about the Mark Q overlaps? What exactly is going on there? And does that potentially mean that Mark knew Q or the reverse, or did he have some kind of common tradition with Q?
Yeah, so one of the things that's noteworthy, right, that again, it's something I spent some time on in my recent books. Even the unusual phrase "the son of the man," as it would be rendered literally, right, if we translate it sort of word for word from Greek into English, it's an unusual way of putting things, and we find it in both Mark and the Q material. Now, obviously, if Luke knew Matthew or vice versa, then that would be, perhaps an explanation. But the fact that it's all throughout this material, right, suggests that this phrase had caught on and was probably in, and it certainly was in Q if Q existed. The John the Baptist material, right? If we take out what's in Mark, then some parts of the story that seem to be required for it to be coherent vanish along with that. And so just using what's in Q seems, and so on the one hand, it's likely that Q contained things that are now only found in Luke or only found in Matthew because only one of them included that material. And if that's the case, then that would allow for a more robust Q document. But it's entirely possible, right? And it's been suggested that Mark might have known Q, or that Q might have known Mark. Each of the gospel authors seems to have been incorporating what was written before, and yet also trying to supplement in interesting ways, right? And we get a good example of the question of when lack of overlap might indicate knowledge, right? In the case of the Gospel of John, where there's still significant debate about whether the author of John knew the other synoptics and knew the synoptic gospels, and if so, how. I gather Mark Goodacre, I think, has a new book out on sort of John has a synoptic gospel, which I haven't read yet. I think I'm not even sure if it's out yet, but saw him posting about it. So Mark tells a story about Jesus as a teacher and doesn't tell a lot of teaching, right? And so one possibility is that Mark takes for granted that there's a body of teaching, maybe even a body that has some narrative in it that is known to people. And he's like, here's, you know the teaching, right? But here's what this person was like, right? And so that, given how much Mark refers to Jesus' teaching and yet fails to include much of it, that seems to me entirely possible.
So what do you think is more likely? Did Q predate Mark or did it postdate it?
As somebody who has not worked through this into some sort of published form, has only read quite a bit about it, thought about it as I've read the synoptics, I think I'd be more inclined, given what I just said, to date Q before Mark. But it's entirely possible that they're coming into existence around the same time, right?
And when do you think that the Q document could have been written down at its earliest point? Or when did it start collecting? When was the, or let me put it another way. When did the sayings of Jesus start getting collected prior to being written down?
Yeah. And we have no way of knowing. It would be great to know, if we knew that, the scenario that, I've been watching The Chosen, but I gather that it depicts people walking around essentially, taking notes while Jesus is teaching. And, that's not really plausible, right? Because means of sort of taking notes on the go, it was just not as easy then as it is now. But it's not at all impossible that some member of the Jesus movement might have, taken upon himself to write things down regularly, right? And that even as Jesus sent out apostles, right, with teaching, that documents were created, because the best way to learn things by heart, right, there's no way to repeat something over and over again and really memorize it in its precise wording without something written down, right? There are also things, it seems to me that a major theme of the Q document was how Jesus stands in relationship to John the Baptist. And it seems to me that that was an issue probably even prior to the crucifixion. And so it's not at all impossible that there was some composition that happened in an effort to persuade some of John's followers who were not convinced to do so, or maybe hadn't heard much about Jesus yet, to sort of rally around him. So the truth is that it could be very early on, right? We don't have any indication that Q included a passion narrative. And given how crucially important it was in early Christianity to make sense of the crucifixion and to say how someone who's the fulfillment of John's predictions could have been executed in this way, right? That was really important. And it was important in relation to the kinds of questions that Q focused on in the form that we can detect it behind Matthew and Luke. So the short answer would have been, I have no idea, but I think it's worth mentioning that because we don't know, right, there isn't really a very, it's important to note that there isn't a sort of a starting point that is, too early for any kind of evidentiary reason, right? That said, I would not be inclined to date it, very early and say, oh yeah, this is coming into existence already during, the period prior to the crucifixion, simply because we don't know that, right? It would be an argument from what is not in Q, and that would be a flimsy basis. But I think it's worth pointing out, right, that we don't know that it's later.
Do you see any historical reliability in the Q source? Do you think any of it goes back to Jesus at all?
Oh yes, I mean, I think a lot of it goes back to Jesus. I'm, you know, I'm somebody who, like many scholars of the New Testament, came from a background in which, had been, a religious background that had encouraged me, maybe required me to simply accept that everything that's in there is what happened. And once you study them, you recognize the differences, you see the developments, you know that that's simply not feasible. A lot of times scholars then swing very far in the opposite direction and become more skeptical of the New Testament texts than one would be of any other ancient text, right? And that's because we're sort of reacting against this earlier background of credulity and of naivety. I'm sort of hoping that the pendulum is kind of coming back in the other direction. And I think that, given, as long as we take seriously the fact that you don't have things being recorded in the way that becomes possible in later times through more widespread literacy, writing things down, things like that, that it's quite likely that a lot of storytelling, a lot of preservation of Jesus' teaching happened, right? And there's still the question of how much of what we get in Q might be adapted already, right, to address new problems, and that's entirely possible. But I'm inclined to think that there's a lot in there that goes back to Jesus.
How does Q, in your view, portray Jesus in contrast to the rest of the Gospels?
So Q, again, if we're not pairing off parts of it, and sort of trimming off parts of it as later additions to the Q document, which I find highly problematic because the sources that we have show that you could have narrative and different types of sayings and stories about miracles, and these were felt to be perfectly compatible within a document. All of them include sayings where we're not entirely sure how to reconcile one saying with another. And so I think that trying to get a document that's consistent in genre and in outlook, and to say that lets us get back to an earlier version of Q, I'm not persuaded that that's the right way to proceed. And so what we get is a Jesus who stands very much in the vein of John the Baptist. He's teaching some radical ethics. He is proclaiming good news to the poor and is pronouncing woes against the rich and is expecting a judgment will happen in which God's righteousness will be revealed and enacted. He's promising that his 12 followers, his 12 apostles, representatives, who are his inner circle, they're not his only followers, his only disciples, right? But these 12 will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And so there is an apocalyptic outlook to this, right? And although some have tried to separate that out as a later layer, John the Baptist was an apocalyptic type of figure and was pronouncing this sort of coming judgment. And to suggest that Jesus, on the one hand, spoke of John as the greatest person who ever lived, even though when the kingdom fully dawned, right, the least will be even greater than John is now, right? But that's not denigrating John, right? It's just saying that the kingdom is going to be that much greater. And so I think that seeing Jesus in continuity with John the Baptist, right, is something that Q actually explicitly emphasized, and that we see that in the sayings, as well as in the narrative bits that are in there.
How is the Q source reconstructed?
Well, the short answer is working through the places where Matthew and Luke overlap on things that are not in Mark, and then just weighing probabilities. Is it more likely that Matthew added something here? Is it more likely that Luke added something or removed something here? Is it likely that in this instance, each of them is doing something different, right? And so there are sayings where there's significant difference and yet overlap, right? So like the law and the prophets were until John. Since then, does the kingdom of God then suffer violence? Is the kingdom of God proclaimed? And so there are points at which we have to either pick one or the other as more likely to be original, or sometimes there are indications that maybe each of them is doing some adaptation and some reworking. But ultimately, it's just working through the overlaps. For some are at least willing to then look at other material that's not in Mark, and sometimes even material that is in Mark, and ask, okay, might this thing that's just in Luke, does it look enough like the Q material that maybe this is Luke including something that Matthew omitted from Q? But then it gets obviously a bit more speculative.
What are the problems with reconstructing Q? Are there different reconstructions of it out there that conflict with others at all?
Yes, that's less, I mean, you will get different judgments about, what was the wording here, right? Or what was the wording there? But the material is ultimately, Q is the Matthew, Luke overlaps on material not in Mark. And so there's not a lot of room for heavy variation, at least as far as those things being included. You will occasionally, though, get, in fact, you will often get scholars who are trying to reconstruct a transmission history of Q with layers of redaction. And so on that, you'll find that there are vastly different possibilities, right? Because it's like with the source criticism of the Pentateuch, right? When you are reconstructing hypothetical sources, even if you have a strong sense that there are sources that are being used, figuring out what was in them, figuring out what might have been left out, figuring out what was added, that becomes much more difficult to say. So in that sense, there are some interesting, very, very interesting differences among Q scholars.
But I want to go back to what you were saying earlier about scribal corruption and Matthew and Luke harmonization, stuff like that. So do you think that could explain a bit of the material that Matthew and Luke have in common that is not thought of to be in Q, but are also very different from one another, such as the minor agreements, or maybe even the infancy narratives?
Yeah, so I mean, to suggest that something like infancy narrative is, that, like, let's say, I mean, the truth is, it has been suggested that the infancy material is stuck on to the beginning of Luke, right, and was not original to that gospel. I'm not persuaded by that. I mean, it seems that, while we do have some large additions, they're fairly rare, right? Things like, that story that's in John 8 in the majority of manuscripts, but not our earliest ones, about the woman who's accused of committing adultery. Those kinds of instances are rare. And so I think that if we're to talk about scribal harmonization, it will be more at the level of, adjusting wording. And sometimes that happens, that happened probably even subconsciously, right? Where the scribe knows it from the other version and is copying and just substitutes, right, in their own head, this other version that's maybe more familiar to them. Or see something like the Lord's Prayer and says, oh, that stupid scribe before me, left out some parts, because we all know it goes like this. And so that certainly is a factor, and that makes it harder to be certain about things like the minor agreements. I think it would be fascinating, and I'm not sure whether, like, let's say AI tools or something like that could help with something like this, but it would be fascinating to go through the variations in the manuscripts we have of Matthew and Luke, and to look for other variations, right? Things that, most people working on the New Testament or reading the New Testament never think about because they're in the critical apparatus in the bottom as variants. But one of the things that's an intriguing possibility is that Q might not have been entirely forgotten, right? Just because Matthew and Luke included it. It may have continued to circulate, even if it stopped circulating at some point, right? Which presumably it did. It may have been remembered, and people might have been familiar with sayings from it, right? As they continue to be passed on verbally. And so there's a possibility that Q, as this sort of third body, right? When you have gravitational attraction, sometimes there's an object that you can't see directly, but you can see the pull it's having on the other things around it. That's how some of the outer planets in our solar system were detected before, or hypothesized, I should say, before they could be seen with telescopes. And so it may be that Q continued to exercise an influence on the manuscript tradition and its transmission and scribes, just as it's possible that some points at which Matthew and Luke didn't agree on Q material, things were harmonized as a result of the scribal copying process. And so there's definitely work to be done there. There's work that has been done, but there's more work to be done, I think.
Could you go back and expand more on the Baptist source material? How much material do you think was contained there in this Baptist source?
Oh, I mean, we don't know. On the other hand, there's a lot of interesting stuff. For instance, among the Mandaeans, I think that between the Mandaean sources, the Proto-Evangelium of James, and the Gospel of Luke, and maybe Matthew, we have indication of infancy material. Luke includes some more ethical teaching attributed to John, and we get extensive ethical teaching in the Mandaean tradition as well. And so it's not impossible that there was something that had the form of what we might even call a gospel of John the Baptist, right? Not a gospel according to John the Baptist, by John the Baptist, but a life and teaching of John the Baptist. So as with Q, right? Q could have been really quite extensive, and we'll have no way of knowing for sure unless we find a copy. All we can detect with confidence, if it even existed, is what Matthew and Luke drew from it. And so in the same way, we can't go beyond, at the most, what we have in the Mandaean sources, used critically because they're much later, and the Gospels.
What do you make of the idea that Q was an oral tradition and not a written document?
Yeah, the problem with that is that there is this extensive agreement on the order of the material, of a sort that you don't get in oral transmission without a written text, right? Now, obviously, I'm aware, others are aware, that people can memorize lengthy bodies of material, right? But that memorization process requires reading the same text over and over again, right? So that you learn it, and you learn it by heart. There is no real way to do that in the absence of a text, right? And so that there was something like a Q source seems to be required by the character of it, as we see it peeking through Matthew and Luke.
So now I want to ask you about the Gospel of Thomas. Is there a link there with Q in any way? Because I know that it's been compared to Q, and it does have material that does appear in Matthew and Luke, at least some of it.
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is that the Gospel of Thomas is not the Q source, right? Because there's no way that it could be used to explain the precise overlaps between Matthew and Luke on material not in Mark, right? It doesn't provide that. It was pointed to as confirming the existence of a genre that Q was hypothesized to be, which was a text that was primarily or entirely sayings of Jesus. And there are a couple of hints of narrative in Thomas. And one of the questions about Thomas is, does that reflect Thomas's knowledge of the earlier Gospels and the other Gospels, or does it indicate that you could have a mostly saying source, but someone putting one together didn't feel that any obligation to be so strict in terms of conforming to a genre? It's also important to note that we were aware of the Gospel of Thomas, although we didn't know that's what it was, prior to the discovery of a Coptic version at Nag Hammadi. And we had fragments of it in Greek from Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, right, which is where a whole bunch of interesting papyri were found. And so an interesting question is, was the Greek version of the Gospel of Thomas, perhaps closer to Q than the Coptic version of Thomas is? Unless we find a copy, we won't know. But finds continue to be made, and things continue to turn up in places, and so I won't stop hoping.
Do you see any of the material in Thomas as coming from Q directly?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, right? And it's not impossible, right? So that we could, and even if Thomas used Matthew and Luke, right? Thomas includes some parables and sayings and things that are not in Matthew or Luke. And if Thomas knew Q and Matthew and Luke, or just knew Q and reworked it in interesting ways, it's entirely possible, right? And I can't think off the top of my head of having looked at an edition of Q reconstructed by somebody where they actually proposed including something from Thomas. I'm pretty sure I've seen articles to that effect, but not a kind of an edition of the whole thing. But my memory just might not be serving me very well at this point. Yeah, so it's possible.
What do you make of Q lacking any miracle accounts? Could that suggest that it was composed at a time before the story was developing with those miraculous ideas, including the resurrection and all that other stuff?
Yeah. So the question is whether whether the things that Q seems to have lacked, are they not in Matthew and Luke because they weren't part of Q? Are they not in Matthew and Luke because they didn't suit the purposes of a Christian gospel author? Were they very different, or were they just not there? And if they weren't there, were they not there because the author wasn't interested, didn't know about those things, had an ideologically different outlook on who Jesus was? And all of those are possible, right? And it's sometimes challenging to try to deduce the motives of an author whose work you have in its entirety, to figure out the motives, and what might have led an author whose work we don't have, except as quoted from others. It's always going to be somewhat speculative. That said, just as Mark places a lot of emphasis, a lot more emphasis on Jesus as a miracle worker than as a teacher, and includes less teaching, Q places, presumably placed more emphasis on Jesus as a teacher. One possibility is that just as Mark may have taken for granted that people know the teaching and so is supplementing it, the Q source might have been taking for granted that people know that Jesus, as part of John the Baptist movement, was an exorcist and represented John on occasion and did the baptizing thing, but don't know his teaching and don't know whether he is faithfully passing on the emphases of John's teaching. And so that may have been a reason for including more of that material. So it's really perilous to make too much of absences, especially when we don't have the text and so don't actually know what was absent, right? It may have been something that was just about the events, but just seemed to fall so far short of what Mark had done that they just stuck with Mark, right, on and his telling of the story. So we really can't know, but there are lots of interesting possibilities, and they're certainly worth exploring.
Well, thank you for joining me today, James McGrath.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. It's always a pleasure talking with you, Jacob, and look forward already to whatever our next conversation happens to be about.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.